Hello, and welcome to episode 73 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Atlanta, Georgia, I'm Nick Zelfra. On today's episode, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Dan Hicks, philosopher of science, data scientist, and science policy researcher at the University of California Merced. Dan's primary academic research focuses on the role of ethical and political values in science and public scientific controversies. Traditional models of such controversies focus on gaps between scientists and the public and explain these gaps in terms of public ignorance and irrationality. In contrast, Dan's approach to these controversies are based on ideas of power, structural oppression, and democratic accountability, in line with Dan's background in feminist philosophy of science and political philosophy. Dan is also interested in bibliometrics, the use of statistics in scientific practice, and data ethics. As a data scientist, much of Dan's work involves network analysis and multi-level generalized linear regression, topic models, and spatial models. Dan combines these tools to help understand questions surrounding academic institutional effectiveness. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Dan. Dan Hicks, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this morning?
I am doing pretty well. It's a nice, sunny, cool, but not cold day here in Merced. And I'm really happy to be on this podcast. I've listened to, I think, every episode and really enjoyed it. And
fantastic.
Happy to be here.
I think, well, you are one of our greatest patrons, and I applaud you and thank you very much for your interest. It's been going along for several years now. We've talking to a number of great people. So yeah, thank you so much. I just wanted to ask, how's the semester getting along for you this spring?
It's going pretty well. It's a little weird. So this is the first Friday in February, 2022, and this is the third week of the semester.
Right.
But it was our first week back in person. So we started the first 2 weeks remote due to Omicron, and I had actually thought up until a week ago that the campus administration was going to have us go remote for another couple of weeks just to let Omicron settle a little bit more.
Right.
But no, they brought us back in person this week. So it was a little weird to do student names, for example, at the beginning of the third week.
Right.
And I did I emphasized to students, I tried to work out a hybrid option for students who weren't comfortable coming in person, but it just wouldn't work with the room and the class format. But still, most of the students showed up. We had a great discussion of Popper, actually.
Excellent.
Teaching philosophy of science this semester.
Great.
And if, our campus does well with Omicron for the next few weeks and we don't get shunted back into class, I think it'll be a good semester.
I hope so. So I know we've, as instructors, we've all been dealing with, Omicron, Delta, coronavirus for, several years now. And I'm curious, how does this semester feel any different in terms of kind of going off and then coming back? Has your approach changed in teaching? What has it been like for you, perhaps in comparison to the most recent times?
I think so. I mentioned I'm teaching philosophy of science this semester, and a year ago I also taught the same class, almost identical syllabus, entirely over Zoom.
Right.
And that prompted me to change some things in the way I teach it, that I've mostly carried over. So I'm not doing too much that's super different relative to a year ago when it was entirely online. But I have changed some things relative to 2 years ago when we started the semester in person.
Right.
And we had no idea.
All of a sudden, it was
that,
we didn't come back from
yeah.
spring break, and yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So, for example, to sort of facilitate discussion, this is a smaller class. Enrollment is capped at 30, but I want the students to be really engaged. So I don't lecture at all. Instead, I want the students to have done the reading and bring in questions and things that they want to discuss. And I sort of facilitate a mix of small group discussion and whole class discussion is the idea. And I found that it was really, really hard to do that over Zoom last year. And so I adapted a suggestion from a friend of mine who has students prepare slides. And the way she does it is each week there's a group of, I think it's 2 students each week work together to prepare the discussion slides and lead discussion. And I was like, okay, can we find a way to sort of make that a little bit less burdensome on particular students in particular weeks? And what I came up with was the whole class is divided into groups. And each group gets okay, your group is responsible for figuring out what is the thesis of the paper. Your group is responsible for identifying jargon or terms that we need to discuss. Your group is responsible for identifying the important example or the case study. And it's the same groups each week for each unit of the course, and they rotate through those slides. So the idea is it'll take them, they have to do the reading in advance. Mm-hmm. It should take them another 30 minutes if they're working well as a group to put together a couple of bullet points on their slide. And that's what we use to start discussion. It's just, okay, someone from the group, can you explain your slide? And then let's see what the rest of the class has questions about or is interested in or talking about more. And then I'm just sort of oh, okay, so you want to talk about holism as a problem for Popper. We haven't talked about holism yet. So, okay, let's find that in the text, break into small groups, figure out where Peter Godfrey Smith is explaining what holism is and why it's a problem for Popper, and then we'll come back together after 15 minutes. And so that works well enough on both Zoom and in person. And I really like it. It seems to be very effective at getting the students to do the reading in advance.
Well, I tend to agree. I'm much more of an engaged. I think lecture definitely has a place as a teaching pedagogical tool, but I like getting the students involved as much as possible. And I think this, so I think I like that idea though, these kind of mini presentations in particular about the piece. Have you found the students are, as in it nowadays? Are they, it's their time to shine as undergrads. How are they doing?
Yeah, we actually talked about this for a good half hour, the very first day of class, which was on Zoom. I put them into breakout rooms and had them do introductions in breakout rooms. And I used basically a Google Doc that they could put things on about how they felt about last semester, how they felt about Omicron, how they felt about coming back this semester. And it was a mix. Some of the students were still exhausted from last semester and were really nervous about Omicron. Other students were more hopeful, more optimistic that we would come back and have something like a normal semester, maybe. So they were really all over the place. And Yeah. I'm sorry.
No. It's. I mean, no. That's good. I haven't taught for about a year and a half. Actually, been mostly just doing research, and so I had left. My last semester teaching was March of 2020, and so I'm just after having taught for so long, I'm just kind of curious as like how the students are getting along and how they might be.
I see.
Experiencing the things, and so part of it is just personal curiosity. And in terms of also just adjusting as we go, obviously I think there's room for optimism. But, this is definitely changing the way in which we teach and in which we approach things. And, it's not something where we can, I imagine, go in and just pretend like everything's okay again. We're still working with this within the context of, and even so, it's like even going in and teaching just like a general phil sci class, it's like, is this something, like even how do you approach the topics or the themes? Is it still feel as the same in the sense of approaching it from a pure like historical, structured way, or is that something you change up in some ways, or like?
I haven't done too much to the content of any of my classes. As like a response to the pandemic.
Right.
I teach a lower division critical thinking class.
Okay.
And I have done some stuff about like sort of QAnon, conspiracy theories, online misinformation.
Right.
And did talk a little bit last semester about in sort of this it was like one class session. It was not mathematical at all, but it was basically explaining like the base rate fallacy. In terms of like, if most people getting hospitalized with COVID have been vaccinated, that doesn't actually mean that the vaccine doesn't protect you from COVID. That we didn't talk about it in terms of like conditional probabilities and the difference between like the two sides of Bayes' theorem. But I was sort of explaining that a little bit with them because that was a big issue. That was like last October. And so that was a big issue. Like just the week before I talked about it, there had been some study out of Israel, I think, that had been kind of misinterpreted pretty widely as raising concerns about the efficacy of the vaccine.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah. No, I find it interesting to see, I guess, also the level at which folks like yourself would integrate, current events into it. But I think there's also some pretty good reason for, maintaining a traditional approach because these are things worth learning and these are things worth thinking about as well. So not everything has to sort of amalgamate in that way or connect. So
yeah, I think it's easier to do that with the critical thinking course because it's entirely about developing various skills in analyzing various types of arguments. So I can pull in examples from current events very easily. When I taught it in fall 2020, I had a lot of examples about voter fraud.
Of course.
Yeah, I think like probably 5 or 6 weeks, the main example was some voter fraud argument. Whereas with the philosophy of science course, I guess with the philosophy of science course, I actually primarily focus on more contemporary journal articles rather than sort of like I don't talk about Hempel. We don't read Kuhn. I more focused on like contemporary recent stuff. I think the oldest piece we read is Cartwright's How the Laws of Physics Lie from 1980.
Yeah.
And I do bring in some contemporary stuff. So, for example, we have an Oreskes piece on the evidence for climate change, for example.
Right.
And this semester new, we're going to read an essay by, I think the name is Lily Hu, H-U. Just got her got their PhD from, I think, MIT.
Mm-hmm.
Essay on like policing and the role of assumptions in sort of econometric analyses of police shootings. Yeah. So like that is sort of, that's definitely responding to current events and using
100. Right.
literally from here. It's just I don't have anything specific on COVID because there's too much else I want to talk about.
I know. I mean, I'm personally feeling a little bit exhausted with it. It was really fun at first when everyone, and I think when I interviewed a couple people, because everyone got to use we were sitting around using our like analytical tools, or like we wanted to help in some way. So here, let me apply this, or let me think about this. And I mean, I still think it's worthwhile, but there's so many, there's also other things to say, and other research that's happening, and other ways, other things that need to be introduced. So I really like the approach that you're taking, though, with bringing in these new papers. Sounds like a good grad course, to be honest. So I think this sounds like a pretty unique intro philosophy of science course. So well done.
Yeah, it's actually originally adapted from this model syllabus that Anya Plutinsky put together a few years ago, where all of the papers are by women. And I had to thin it out a little bit because most of the students aren't philosophy majors.
Sure.
So we have one main reading each week, rather than two, as you would normally do in an upper division course. And I think the only week where there isn't at least one author who's a woman is Peter Godfrey Smith, the chapter from his textbook that's on Popper. Because I couldn't find a good discussion of Popper by a woman philosopher of science. And I've tried to also get other dimensions of demographic diversity in the author list, but that's been harder to do. But yeah,
I can believe it though. I mean, I'm aware of some of the. Yeah, I mean, times are changing, but it's historically, yeah. Well, so it sounds like you've put a lot of thought into your teaching, and I'm curious to know. We all find our different ways into philosophy of science, one way or the other. So I'm curious to hear your story and how you came to become a researcher and a teacher and someone who is currently doing and going on to do great things. So Dan, tell me a little bit about where did you grow up?
Yeah. So I actually want to preface my answer to that by noting that my ancestors include the Harvey brothers, a pair of Irish refugees who escaped the Great Famine in Ireland in the mid-19th century and came to California during the Gold Rush as settlers. And so one branch of my family has a very long very deep ties to California and probably the nastier settler colonial aspects of California's history as well. That's something I actually think about a lot recently. I was born in the Bay Area, and when I was a year old, my parents moved us up to a small town called Placerville, which is halfway between Sacramento and South Lake Tahoe in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. And my mom still lives there, and the rest of my family is in the Sacramento area. So I grew up on sort of the weird boundary of the suburbs. My dad had a job down in Sacramento that he commuted to about an hour every day. But we lived on 2 acres that were wooded. I wasn't into like go-karts and stuff like that, but my brother was. He would ride go-karts all over our sort of neighborhood. I would like wander around between the yards, following the seasonal creeks and looking at critters in them. And like you drive, or not even drive, you walk over the hill at the back of our property, and it's like 500 acres is the next piece of property, and it includes like a 50-acre Christmas tree farm.
Wow.
So like it was this weird combination of like super rural lifestyle with like a lot of the fathers in the development commuted down to Sacramento for work.
Interesting. So there wasn't like, for example, like local farming or other kind of like wildlife industry. It was like they still went into the city essentially.
Not a lot of farming like immediately around, but again, there was the Christmas tree farm very close. A lot of people had horses, actually, and not very far away, like a 10-minute, 15-minute drive, is an area called Apple Hill, which is still known for like growing a lot of fruit trees, apples, pears, and now these days is also kind of like a mini wine region in California. In high school, I think the largest club was Future Farmers of America. Knew a lot of kids who did 4-H. So there was also that rural aspect.
California 4-H. Interesting. I always hear about it in the Midwest, but that's something. Yeah. Okay. All right. So you say you weren't into go-karts or doing the whole, that kind of thing, but which I can imagine. Sometimes I have big property, doing all this whatever auto stuff. I don't know. Yeah. But so I guess tell me, what did you find yourself interested in? And I mean, was it, did you take an interest in science and philosophy early on, did you have other interests growing up?
Yeah, I was a very avid reader, and I'm very introverted, so I've never been good at making friends. And with like the distances, it was just often hard to go see friends. So I spent a lot of time kind of wandering around outdoors. Read a lot of science fiction, especially growing up. A little bit of fantasy, but like never really got into that as much. My dad is a scientist from a line of scientists. And so I always got like a strong push towards science from that side of my family.
What kind of science?
He he's retired now, an industrial hygienist. Which not many people know what that means. Basically, he worked as a consultant, sort of hired by various companies to evaluate the environmental quality, especially of indoor environments. Right. So a lot of testing for asbestos, a lot of testing for hazardous mold. Those are probably the two things he did most often. But also, like, if there's a workplace where someone, might be exposed to other toxic chemicals, or if there were, like, apartment buildings where there were concerns that hadn't been maintained, apartment complexes where there were concerns that it might not be maintained properly and people might be getting sick because of that, he would be the kind of person you would hire to come in and do samples and evaluate those potential hazards. So very science-oriented on that side of the family. I have a cousin on that side who got a PhD in molecular biology. And let's see, our grandfather on that side of the family was a chemist. So a long line of scientists.
Yeah, right. No. Well, so it's so it's very much in the purview of it's a Yeah, you're familiar with academic for scientific work, whether it's in industry or in an academic setting. Okay. So okay.
Yeah, so I had this strong push towards science. Was fascinated when we got our first computer in the late 1980s.
Oh, awesome.
So spent a lot of time on the computer in the 90s, the early internet. I think there was a pretty strong expectation that I was going to be a software engineer when I went to college. And then I took my first computer science course in college and found it utterly boring.
Oh man. Well, so expectation from scientists and then software engineers. So what was it? What did software engineering and I guess just not provide that you were after?
Sorry, the question got just a little garbled for a second.
Oh, sure. So, I mean, I guess it's kind of self-explanatory, but what was it about software engineering that was just not for you?
That was a long time ago. What exactly was it? I think I felt it was a little too much puzzle solving, which it might be kind of surprising given other aspects of my personality. I've never really been interested in puzzles. Like Wordle is super big right now week on social media.
Yeah.
I don't care at all. I have no interest
I love Wordle.
in Wordle.
I mean, I love puzzles, so yeah.
And like some people like puzzles, that's fine. I just have no interest in that. And so like that aspect of software engineering doesn't do it for me. And I think maybe it seemed sort of a little too small or a little too narrow or something along those lines compared to, I was taking classes in political science that I found much more exciting and interesting. And I ended up sort of taking some undergrad math classes on an accelerated scale and loved like geometry and linear algebra. And super weird. People usually hate linear algebra, but I love linear algebra.
You like it from like a epistemic stance or something. That's really cool. A lot of people just hate it because it's like the next step on the course of engineering or whatever it is, medical school or something like that. So
and I think the way it's typically taught, it's often the first undergraduate course where students have to do proofs. And so it's not just cranking through the problem sets anymore, or like sort of the way calculus is typically taught is here's this kind of problem, here's how you solve it, and then you practice doing that problem a bunch. Linear algebra was the first class, and often is the first class where you have to actually like prove things, and the lecture is based around proofs and stuff like that. And I absolutely love that. And I think that switch is a big transition for a lot of math students. And so I think that's why a lot of people dislike linear algebra, but I love linear algebra.
All right. So finding things out. So where did the philosophy part come in?
So I think it was my second year of undergrad. I was at a liberal arts school, University of Puget Sound, that I didn't recognize this as a thing like going in, but one very distinctive thing about the way Puget Sound did its general ed requirements, at least at the time, is that they included a surprising emphasis on the history of science and thinking about science in its social context. And so one of the ways I satisfied the lab science requirements was taking a course called the History and Practice of Ancient Astronomy, where we used like straight edge and compass to make a geographically appropriate sundial.
Oh, cool.
Using, yeah.
And probably not what you thought you were signing up for as well. But perhaps in a historical...
I wanted something a little bit different from like the high school style physics and biology science classes. And this was very clearly something different.
Yeah.
And very interesting. It was taught by this historian of physics, who also incorporated some discussion about like the cultural significance of astronomy in Mesopotamia and for the ancient Greeks and stuff like that. I went on to take another class with him that was on, it was a kind of a similar thing based around replicating Newton's experiments with light in the optics.
Okay.
And so doing stuff with like lots of prisms, mirrors, lenses, and then at the end playing around with a wave tank to do various experiments. I think those were more like Huygens experiments on like the wave transmission of light. Mm-hmm. And again, that included some discussion of like the social context, like why light... Actually, like why the particle versus wave status of light was culturally significant. I forget why now, but that was an important part of it. So I effectively was taking integrated history and philosophy of science courses to satisfy science GE requirements. Then, to satisfy another requirement, I took a class that was basically a survey of social philosophy. I think we started with Hobbes' Leviathan and something by Rousseau, I forget what. And it sort of ended with, let's see, Marx and Nietzsche were kind of towards the end. There was some Weber in there. Foucault, I think, was one of the last things we read in that class. And I had not taken, this was taught by a philosopher, a Nietzsche scholar, and this was really my first contact with philosophy. And it kind of blew my mind a little. I had a lot of fun, like debating with the professor during class time. I was maybe a little bit that guy.
That's okay.
Yeah, but it definitely sucked me in, and then led me my senior year to take some philosophy of science classes. Lynn Hankinson Nelson, who I believe recently retired from Washington, University of Washington. She was actually at Puget Sound for a year, replacing Heather Douglas, who was also there, and who I never met during my time there.
Oh, what a shame.
Heather and I are friends now, but like we never met when I was a student there and she was teaching. She was fresh out of grad school. It was her first job. She was on break for a year. Lynn came in for a year, and I took 2 classes from her, a philosophy of science survey. And then, what was the other class? Oh, it was on Darwin. Like Darwin and social context. So there was like evolution versus creation stuff in there. In one of the 2, we read James Watson's Double Helix, sort of his rather fictionalized but biographical account of how he and Crick stole some data from Rosalind Franklin, but then discovered DNA. And there was some feminist philosophy of science in there as well, because that's something that Lynn was part of that community. And like if sort of the social philosophy class like really opened my eyes, it was those classes from Lynn that really made me want to become a philosopher of science. And yeah, like I had so much fun, learned so much from her in those two classes. And for me, both of those classes really like put science into its social and political context in ways that had not occurred to me could be possible. Like this was a way I could combine my love of science that I had had since I was growing up with my interest in politics. When I finished, I was a double major in math and political science, so I always also had this social science perspective on things, and I could put them together in this thing that had been presented to me as philosophy of science.
I was just going to say, because a lot of us who get into philosophy of science, and I think you perhaps just answered this, but what is coming from a line of scientists instead of going into the science, what is it that was most meaningful to you that you get from being a philosopher of science or going into study philosophy of science that you might not get had you gone to perhaps a more traditional route into delving into one of the sciences?
That's actually also a great question about sort of the next phase after undergrad.
Let's use that as a jumping point.
I realized somewhere during undergrad that I really wanted to be a professor. I wanted to go to grad school. And actually started off as a math grad student at the University of Illinois in Chicago. I was there for 3 years. I got to the point where I had to start my thesis in that program and realized that I was not doing math for fun. I wasn't proving things for fun. I was proving things for class. I found the classes really interesting and enjoyable, and like I really was fascinated by low-dimensional topology. Specifically, that probably would have been what I had gone into. But for fun, I was reading like feminist philosophy of science and feminist science studies, more STS and history types of things, and philosophy of math, and realized like I don't want to spend the rest of my life teaching calculus, which is what a math PhD would have led me to. Right. And so with not enough advice, and basically just like a handful of philosophy classes as an undergrad, not even a minor, I started to apply to HPS programs. And it took a couple of rounds before I got accepted. But I did eventually get into Notre Dame. It was the only place that accepted me in 2 or 3 rounds of applications. And they accepted me like the day before the April 15th deadline. So
I know that feeling.
Got into a grad program in philosophy.
That's how I got into Indiana. It was like the 15th. Oh, yeah. Hey, call you up. But hey, and Notre Dame's HPS program is very well known, well ranked. So very and really perfect for this like the combination of HPS that I had gotten a little bit of as an undergrad, because the combination of history and philosophy of science is very, very important to that program, and also for doing feminist philosophy of science, which now has kind of over the last 10 years has kind of developed, a branch of it has kind of developed into science policy and values as a more recognized subfield. It would have been very hard for me to do a science, values, and policy kind of dissertation at another program at that time. So I was very, very fortunate that I just barely got into like one of the few programs that really was a very, very good fit for my interests. Yeah, we're starting to see science and values programs or HPS programs with that context start to come about, especially as folks like yourself are getting jobs in these new departments and wanting to teach them. But I imagine this was around the late 2000s, early 2010s. It just wasn't as prominent, and it was more just being an HPS program was good enough, or at that time. But without a number of these other, integrated was kind of niche almost, and I think you're a few years ahead of me, but I think, I don't know if does that sound right? That just wasn't.
Yeah. So I got into Notre Dame in 2005. Right. And sort of the big mainstreaming of science, values, and policy really got started in 2009 with Heather Douglas's book, Science, Policy, and the Value-Free Ideal. It was that book, there have been some discussions of inductive risk prior to her book, but it hadn't become sort of this big, well-recognized topic that a lot of people took seriously.
Right.
I think basically prior to that, and not long prior to that, if there were discussions of what we now think of as values in philosophy, it was being done by feminist philosophers or their critics. The critics were generally defending the value-free ideal, and a lot of this was still wrapped up in the nastiness of the science wars of the 1990s.
Right.
So in 2005, this was not a respectable topic.
Definitely.
Yeah, and it was really with Heather's book in 2009, which came out right as I started working on my dissertation. And so even then it still took a few years. I think it was a couple years later that Philip Kitcher wrote a book in which he said, the inductive risk argument changed my mind.
Wow.
I think that played a big role in it. And things have grown a lot over the last 10 years, I think in large part because of Heather's book.
It's going to be a really interesting, Hopos paper in 50 years or so to see this kind of early 2000s shift in, I just see so many, I see so many job postings. I see, the folks I've interviewed have shifted their research a little bit more. Maybe those who are into ethics have just broadened their appeal. So, great. And so I see here your project was on scientific practices and their social context. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about, this project and how it went and tell us a little about it.
Yeah. So one of the required classes I had to do at Notre Dame was basically 20th century ethics survey. And sort of the pivotal piece of that course was reading Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue. McIntyre was a professor of Notre Dame at the time, but had stopped working with grad students. McIntyre, for folks, he's become more niche these days. He was very big in the 80s, which is, forget exactly when After Virtue was published. I should know that off the top of my head. McIntyre became well known as one of the folks who played a major role in reviving virtue ethics, along with Elizabeth Anscombe was also big in this movement. And Philippa Foot, also known as sort of bringing about the revival of virtue ethics. And I basically hadn't taken an ethics class before. And I think McIntyre is not so popular today outside of conservative Catholic circles, which I think is a shame. After Virtue really changed the way I think about ethics. And in particular, one of the central chapters of After Virtue is laying out a conception of practice, where the examples are like chess. He has some famous examples from some of his later writing about the work on a fishing boat, but also like a fishing community as sort of a community united by practices. And I read this. I remember I was sitting in the local coffee shop that I like to work at in South Bend, Indiana, and was reading after Virtue over spring break, because the assignment over spring break was like read the entire book.
Right.
And read this chapter and was like, this is science. You could totally describe science as a practice in this way. And like, a practice isn't just like this social thing that people do. It also like has certain specific constitutive goods that it aims at. And there are virtues of doing the practice well that correspond to like what it is to produce high quality goods, kinds of things. It's this very articulated structure that he lays out in this chapter. And it's like, you can talk about science in this way. And basically that's what I did in my dissertation, was in a more kind of analytical mode that McIntyre typically writes in, sort of lay out, okay, what is a practice? It has these elements. How do we understand science as a social practice, and how do we use that specifically to think about how feminism has contributed to the development of science? And I developed this idea I called joint practitioners, which is looking at drawing on work by especially like Alison Wiley on primatologists and feminist archaeologists, these sort of feminist scientists who translated gender critiques into the scientific, into the mainstream idiom of their scientific field, and in doing so stimulated progress, methodological progress in that field. That was sort of the big overall argument was we can, if we think about science as a social practice, we can make sense of how feminism is contributing to science. I later wrote a paper, the New Direction for Philosophy of Science paper, where I use some elements of that to also think about, at the same time, we can use this to understand how the influence of industry can be pernicious, because these are both cases where values are influencing science. And if we accept the value-free ideal, well, both of those are bad. But look, the feminists have actually been beneficial. And because this is talking about the aims of science, and one point that I developed in the dissertation was that there are two very different views you can find in the philosophical literature about what the aims of science are. On the one hand, there's a view that the aims of science are purely epistemic. Science is only there to produce knowledge. Maybe it's in a realist sense, maybe it's more in a von Frossen save the phenomena sense, but however we understand the aims being only knowledge, purely epistemic, that's like one way to go.
Sure.
Then another understanding of the aims of science that you find, for example, from feminists, and I think you find actually in a lot of practicing scientists, is that science also has practicals. We want science to be able to do things out in the world. And if you have this very different understanding of what the aims of science are, I think you have a very different understanding of like what role non-epistemic values can and should play in science. And so this was one version of what we now call the aims approach, thinking about values in science.
So could you give an example of something like a non-epistemic value that you perhaps described a little bit in your book and could kind of make sense? I imagine it has something to do with being able to do something, but yeah.
Yeah, so I actually don't... I have some issues with the distinction between like epistemic and non-epistemic values, the way it usually shows up in the literature. But we don't need to go into that right now. A common example of a non-epistemic value would be sort of feminist values or environmentalist values, or a concern with human health, for example, in the context of like biomedical research or public health research.
Well-being, perhaps, or something like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Basically, like anything that's not knowledge.
There's a lot.
Considered a non-epistemic value. Yeah.
But it's done in such a way that that becomes like this one of the central aim, as opposed to amassing the knowledge first and then applying it later, which is usually seen as like when I had traditional psych training in psychology, and so the training was, we want to use everything that we know eventually, but the first step one is to know, and figure out, and then step two. I mean, that's not actually how it works all of the time, but that's often how it's taught and instructed, that the value is of more of an epistemic value, and then only secondarily is that we apply. And what I'm hearing you saying is these two aims are they often, I mean, they're working simultaneously in the practice of, and the actual practice of science, and that has certain consequences of how we interpret and see and understand results. So I think that's an important for someone like, almost I would say, a layman in terms of scientific values like me, to just kind of get and understand is how is it really how are we really thinking differently here about this?
The terminology I used in the dissertation haven't really used since, but it's in a paper that I'm hoping is going to get accepted any day now, is the difference between accidents and goals. It's the somewhat Aristotelian language, where accidents are just sort of, this wasn't what we were trying to do. We don't really care if we get this or not, but it can be nice if we got it. And on what I call the narrow view of science, like the practical uses of science are these kinds of happy accidents. We weren't trying to cure COVID. It's just a happy accident that we can treat COVID or whatever. Right. Versus, no, what we're trying to do is like develop a vaccine that will protect people against COVID. That's the aim, and we need some knowledge to get there. And maybe we even think that like that knowledge is valuable on its own for its own sake. We can learn things even if we don't end up producing a successful vaccine. But we still, we're doing the science because we want the vaccine.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the difference between accidents and goals.
Right. Okay. So yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing this interesting, the way things came out and the shift of in thinking. It's very, it's fun and interesting to see how people come to their ideas. And so it sounds like this led you into working in, as you mentioned, into the science and values. So, okay, well, tell us a little bit about, in working on this dissertation project, where did it lead you to and take you to? So, upon completion, what was next?
Yeah. Well, upon completion, I realized I don't want to write a book.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and it was a very long monograph of a dissertation. It was sort of a very traditional dissertation in that way.
Right.
And I didn't want to write a book. And I actually wanted to do something very practically oriented. And I had been involved with the local food co-op my last couple of years of grad school, and that got me very interested in working on some food issues for a bit. So I pivoted and spent the next few years, including the first couple of postdocs I had at Notre Dame and then at Western Ontario, writing about genetically modified foods. And had several papers come out of that project. Looking at both the philosophy of science aspects, as well as sort of political aspects. So I had kind of the last paper I wrote on that was about because the regulation of genetically modified foods focuses entirely on their safety for human consumption, the regulatory institutions systematically ignore a bunch of concerns that people have that I sometimes put under the tagline Monsanto is evil. Monsanto doesn't exist anymore, but we still talk about Monsanto a lot in the context of genetically modified foods.
I didn't even know they didn't exist.
Yeah.
That's news to me.
A lot of concerns about like Monsanto as a bully to small farmers and these kinds of things have nothing to do with whether or not the foods are safe to eat. And so what I argued in these last papers was that like the regulatory institutions systematically exclude certain kinds of concerns, and this is why the debate won't go away. Was because people who have these concerns literally have no one in government who can evaluate their concerns.
Oof. That's grim. Yeah. So that's fast. So that's, I mean, so I guess suppose, what are some of the additional takeaways that you found in doing this, in this work? And kind of curious, working in the local co-op, was this something that, I'm curious how that might have informed your work as well.
I missed a word in there. How working on what?
Working with you said at least your familiarity with a co-op, you were saying? How that might have informed your, I don't know, interest or approach or consideration.
Yeah, I think it definitely got me more interested in It got me more interested in community-based research, community-based participatory research, both theoretically and with the idea of wanting to address the concerns of people outside of philosophy. Scientists, at the time, it was sort of scientists and members of the co-op, and actually a lot of the members of the co-op were biology faculty and grad students at Notre Dame. And there was this internal debate about genetically modified foods at the co-op, which is part of how I got interested in it. And from there, it led to an interest in like trying to do work to engage with policymakers.
Yeah.
And potentially like moving into policy, which was sort of the big move I made after my postdoc at Western.
So tell us, I'm really curious about that. So after doing some great postdocs at Notre Dame and Western, you had a very interesting experience, one that not many of us in philosophy of science might even look to, but with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS in DC. So that sounds really cool. I want to look into this.
Yeah.
I remember one of my former master's advisors he was really big in bioethics, and so was doing a lot of AAAS stuff. But just tell us a little about your experience with this postdoc or this position, I should say, and
Yeah, so the AAAS Policy Fellowship is basically, it's somewhat like a postdoc in that it starts in like the very beginning of September, so roughly coincides with the academic year, and it's a temporary thing on sort of a 1 to 2 year appointment. So it feels a little bit like a postdoc in terms of sort of how it's structured. And in partly that's to accommodate academics. The aim of the policy fellowship is basically to bring science and sort of science-oriented PhDs into policy settings in the federal government. There's sort of there are kind of two tracks within it, one for congressional fellowships and one for placements in the executive branch. I did the executive branch one. And so I spent a year at the Environmental Protection Agency, working in the EPA headquarters, which is like 2 blocks from the White House, and it's across the street from the Museum of National History. Yeah, so like right in the middle of DC. And I was working with what was the program called? Chemical Safety for Sustainability, which is a group of scientists, like researchers at EPA, developing computational toxicology methods, a combination of using robotics to kind of scale up chemical assays, and using computer models of sort of how chemicals behave in organisms to address this backload we have of tens of thousands of chemicals that are widely used in commerce that are just kind of assumed to be safe. We don't have systematic data, and the regulations don't. The way the regulations are structured, because these chemicals were in use before the laws were passed, manufacturers didn't have to actually test for the safety of their chemicals.
That doesn't sound good at all. I got to tell you, Dan.
No.
Oh my God. They're like, oh yeah, well I guess we'll get around to it now to test. Oh boy. Ugh.
My Bluetooth has
I got you back.
just done something.
You're back.
You can hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah, it cut out for a minute, but yeah.
I don't know why my Bluetooth is acting up, but okay.
This is fine.
Yeah, we'll have to go with the slightly worse audio.
Sounds pretty good now, actually. So yeah, okay.
Yeah, so I spent that first year basically hanging out with toxicologists, biologists, endocrinologists, chemists, both on the research side, and I hung out with folks in the endocrine disruptor program at EPA. Who were very interested in using this cutting-edge science. So I got to be a fly on a wall on some really fascinating discussions about basically like science translation, like how this cutting-edge science gets translated or not into making policy. Absolutely amazing. They mostly had no idea what to do with a philosopher. So
I know that feeling.
My existence, I had been sort of learning a little bit of stats, a little bit of Python, a little bit of R.
Nice.
Over the previous few years, and sort of taught myself to do bibliometrics.
Yes. When you say data, people get that, and they're like, "Oh, of course."
Yes.
They see the utility in it above conceptual. That being said, it is, and I don't want to discredit it, but yeah, cool.
Yeah. So I did my first real empirical project, which is titled something like "Bibliometrics for Social Validation," where I borrow, I think, I was citing Longino and a couple other philosophers of science to sort of theoretically motivate, okay, we have this new toxicology research. How well is it being received by the community of toxicologists? And sort of the way I came up to do that was to construct this big citation network and look to see, are the papers by the EPA scientists isolated within the citation network or not? And so this was a big, complicated project. I'd never done anything like this before. I had no one advising me on how to do this.
You're a self-starter, I tell you.
It was
I'm very impressed.
Okay, it's this quantitative thing. I can tell my boss, who isn't technically my boss because I wasn't technically an employee of EPA, but basically it was my boss. I could tell her I was doing this quantitative thing, and she's a chemist, so she respected that. And meanwhile, I got to watch some really cool conversations. Unfortunately, I could only do that for a year. Combination of funding issues and then some personnel changes at EPA meant that I tried to move to a different office, but literally the week someone needed to sign off, no one had the authority to sign it off.
Oh boy.
Yeah. So then I spent the next year at the National Science Foundation, which ended up working out well because it meant during the 2 years I did this policy fellowship, I got to spend a year looking at the science for policy side of things at EPA, and then the policy for science side of things at NSF. I worked with the National Robotics Initiative, which is this big multi-agency funding mechanism for robotics research. So I got to interact with folks at a bunch of different agencies outside of NSF. And I did another bibliometrics project there. This program had been around for 5 years, and they wanted sort of a big analysis of like what had the program accomplished. And so I did some text mining with that. I did some work with like how has the co-author network in the robotics community changed since this program came along. Did some work with like has this encouraged researchers to publish in areas where robotics research you wouldn't normally expect to get published. So more work sort of developing bibliometrics and statistics skills. And they also wanted me to write something about like from a philosophical perspective about public controversy surrounding robotics. So I wrote a little paper about how like the Teamsters Union could potentially throw a wrench in efforts to allow self-driving trucks on highways. And so
I've thought about that. Well, not specifically the Teamsters Union, but just kind of what are the consequences? That seems like such a huge consequence for a number of things. Jobs, just the research. It could. Yeah, I've been curious when that's going to happen and what. That's interesting.
Yeah. Since I did that fellowship, a lot of the companies that had invested a lot in self-driving automated vehicle technology have actually disinvested in it because it turns out to be really, really hard to do especially a fully automated vehicle. Like roads are much more complicated than just like lines you follow.
Right.
And so I think like the prospects for automated vehicles are much further out today than they seem to be circa 2016, 2017. Like in 2017, like people were announcing road tests of trucks.
Of semis. Jeez.
Yeah. And then like I never saw announcements of how.
I think around that time I remember reading articles and thinking like, okay, like I guess this is gonna be the next thing. But now the focus has been more on like for the public, I think, like less so. But perhaps in industry, it's in the background of this kind of.
I think, like, so the advantage of trucks. For the engineers developing automated vehicles, the advantage of trucks is that you can have sort of a warehouse next to the highway and another warehouse next to the highway.
Right.
And you don't need to worry about like actually navigating the mess of city streets. Highways are way easier. Highways still aren't just like lines you can follow,
right? But
they are much simpler intentionally by design. Highways are much simpler than like a city navigating a city street.
Right.
So that's also part of why I thought like, okay, if there's going to be like a big push to allow widespread use of automated vehicles, it's probably going to come from trucks first, because like that's where the technology is going to develop. Teamsters still get relatively high wages, although like the wage structure of the trucking industry is super complicated because like a lot of them are independent contractors. Like it's very messy, but like if you can automate a truck driver, you will save a lot of money.
Oh, I can imagine.
But it's a relatively easy problem. And so this is where I expected like, okay, this is probably where like the industry would push for first. And there's also this big union that would object to it. And so like if I sort of think about this the way I thought about genetically modified foods and the way I think about climate, like how could they use reasonable objections to the science to stymie the regulatory process? And it's actually really hard to determine how safe an AI driver is. There are like a bunch of interesting epistemic questions, and you need to rely on a bunch of assumptions, and there's like inductive risk stuff here.
Yeah. How safe and how safe enough? How do you eventually come to that distinction of between? So that's
sort of laying out this little scenario for the folks at NSF who wanted to see what I thought about robotics from an ethics and philosophy science perspective.
Do you think in terms of especially conducting science, especially in the regulatory, is this something more like a hypothetical, or is this something that we've seen historically in terms of folks figuring out ways to stymie production or progress by, you know what I'm saying? Like by navigating, by using science as a way to do, like the aim is like anti-progress or something, like in this interesting truck case. Like, is this, that's interesting. Or I can imagine, perhaps, especially with like the GMOs, if you're trying to do something where you very strongly are opposed to these GMOs, you don't, I'm curious, what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah. So the scenario in the paper with like the Teamsters Union and automated truck safety, that's entirely hypothetical.
Right.
And that's
a very interesting hypothetical. Yeah.
But it was definitely inspired by, not so much with genetically modified foods. I think primarily because there hasn't been like a really big organized industry pushing against those. Mm-hmm. But more so like tobacco and climate change and lead pipes and lead paint and lead in gasoline.
Oh, right, of course.
Bisphenol A and other plastics, and sort of going down the list. These many cases where a regulated industry has resisted regulation by raising concerns about science. I actually captured a lot of this thinking together around the same time as I was writing the automated vehicle paper into an essay for the magazine Issues in Science and Technology. Mm-hmm. That essay is called Scientific Controversies as Proxy Politics. And that's basically what I argue there, is that a lot of time these big controversies we have about, like, is the science good enough, are actually proxies for political controversies about genetically modified foods or regulating fossil fuels, or that's the one time I dipped my toe into the vaccine controversy, where it was sort of a proxy for like parental responsibility and parental autonomy for the safety and well-being of children.
Right. That's really interesting. No, that's fascinating. I would really like to read this paper. I think, I'm familiar with these things, and I've studied a bit about, especially with the GMO. But just in the history of science, just getting fascinated with the kinds of things that people could do, or scientists could do, or industries could do in terms of, using these things as proxies. It sounds, I think there's a number of different cases that could come about. That's fascinating. So that's a really cool project. Thank you. No, thanks for sharing, Dan. Okay, so your time there, it sounds like some fascinating work was done. And then I guess why don't you tell us and catch us up to speed with kind of, so I know you describe a little bit about kind of being now really into philosophy of data science and I noticed that you were working at UC Davis for a bit. So why don't you tell us about this next shift in your career in terms of, focusing on that?
Yeah. So over the course of 2016, I was at EPA at the beginning of that year. For most of that year, loved it. Had started to build some connections to career staff at EPA. We were talking about the possibility of me getting a permanent job there. When my fellowship ended, switched to NSF, continued these connections with folks at EPA, and then the election happened. And all of a sudden, like all of the contacts I knew at EPA, like retired. And there was a big hiring freeze in the federal government. And also a lot of folks who had expected to get political appointments in the Clinton administration were now trying to find jobs with like think tanks and stuff like that elsewhere.
Sure.
So the job market, the policy job market in DC was a complete mess in 2017, which is when my time at NSF ended. And again, like a postdoc, that wasn't a permanent position. So I had to figure out what I was doing next. And much like a postdoc, I spent whose time was running out and was trying to find an academic job. I spent a lot of time in 2017 writing job applications for policy-oriented stuff and got nowhere. And then in like July, my fellowship ended at the end of August. In July, I saw this ad for a postdoc at Davis.
In July, too. Interesting.
Yeah. It was announced postdoc at Davis, and they wanted, it was something like bibliometrics, but make it more interesting.
Okay.
And I spent the last 2 years doing bibliometrics projects at both EPA and NSF. I had some perspective as a philosopher of science on like sort of strengths and weaknesses of traditional bibliometrics and where they could be done differently and maybe better. I had spent a lot of time writing code in Python and R at that point, so I was very fluent in the languages they wanted. And okay, what the hell? I'll submit an application. And very quickly got an interview, got a job offer, and then had to make the decision of whether or not I was going to stay in DC, try to continue doing policy.
Right.
Potentially being unemployed for an indefinite period of time. I did have some savings, but who knows when I would be able to get a job. Or move to California. Maybe there would be policy opportunities at the state level in California. There's some environmental NGOs that have offices in San Francisco. But I would be moving back home.
Right.
I almost certainly wouldn't get an academic job. I wouldn't get a faculty job because my family would disown me if I moved far away again. So that like, very restricted geographic scope for any future academic job searches. So I talked with a couple of mentors, and at that point it was basically like, you know, I love doing policy work. There are possibilities for that in California. It would be great to be back with my family again. At this point I'd written 150 academic job applications that had gone nowhere.
Yep.
So let's go for it. Oh, and like there's always the possibility with the data science skills I developed of getting a job in the tech industry in the Bay Area. Like that was a possibility there.
Yeah.
So, hey, let's go for it. Moved across the country, spent a fantastic couple of years at Davis. I like sort of fully committed to doing empirical bibliometrics from like the institutional side. Didn't really write much philosophy during those years. And read a bunch of statistics. My boss in that postdoc was a statistician, actually one of the developers of R.
Very
so
cool.
I learned a ton more about R. I got to do office hours where I was giving STEM grad students. I was helping STEM grad students figure out R questions and data management questions. It was just really, really fun. And I also got to hang out with Roberta Milstein and Jim Griesmer, philosophers of biology at Davis. They have a little weekly lab group for their grad students that I joined. So I got to have regular philosophy of science discussions again, which was great. And it was just a really fantastic community. I was half an hour from my brother's house. I was an hour from my mom's house. So I got to see my family.
Full circle again. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just really, really, it was really, really great. And then my time there was running out.
Okay.
And I had not planned to do an academic job market search. And then there were ads for a data ethics position at a university. I won't say where exactly. It was a little bit far away, but not too far. And then another one, and then there was a position at UC Merced. And I forget exactly how this one was advertised. It was some combination of philosophy and data science is what they were looking for.
Sure.
So, UC Merced is definitely nearby. It's about 2 hours from Davis. 2 hours south of Sacramento. So Merced is close. I didn't know anything about it because UC Merced didn't exist when I was growing up. But Merced is close. This other university, talked with my family. They were okay with me doing this.
Yeah.
Then I had to address, do I want to put myself through the stress of going on the academic job market again?
Yeah.
I had some really great conversations with some really supportive academic friends. And went into it with the mindset of, I'm just going to drop some job applications. And if I get interviewed, cool. If I get a job, cool. If not, it's fine. There's tons of data science opportunities. Not even going to worry about it. It's just like applying for a non-academic job. Only the timing is different and the paperwork is different.
Right.
And then somehow got the job at Merced.
Fantastic.
Did not expect it at all. But got the call in spring of 2019 and wrapped things up at Davis, more or less. I've actually spent most of the last couple of years, my research time, finishing up old projects from Davis.
Hey.
And moved down here. I've been here since.
That's great. What a story. Well, I mean, you've come, so I'm really happy to hear, and it sounds like it's been a good fit so far, and a lot of things, puzzle pieces have come together. Mm-hmm. So I'm very happy to hear that. So you mentioned something whereby you teach. We started our conversation off at some of the undergrad courses of philosophy of science and critical thinking, but you had mentioned in our own conversation something about a data science grad course that you teach. So I was curious if you could tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So a significant part of the hire for this position was building up data science education here at UC Merced. And I think part of what they were interested in what I could bring was, all the philosophy background, philosophy of science, ethics, and political philosophy perspectives, but also work experience doing data science. So it's not just like I'm standing outside as a philosopher commenting on it. I'm actually like have a lot of experience doing data science work. And like even things like teaching workshops on data science to grad students at Davis. And so for that, I developed a graduate methods course, which right now is formally offered through the cognitive science program. As sort of the initial home for it, but I'm interested in getting it cross-listed in the future. I've had students from political science, psychology, public health, I think there was one public health grad student. Electrical engineer wandered in. I'm not quite sure how much he got out of the course, but yeah, so it's interdisciplinary graduate course targeted really across the social and behavioral sciences. So I get a bunch of examples from all over the place. And we do a mix of very concrete data sciencey things like exploratory data analysis, for example. We do another very concrete thing that we do is we try to we take a paper that's been published that has the data and the code available, and we try to reproduce it in the sense of can you run the code on the data and get numerically the same output. Turns out this can be rather involved and gives you a very good understanding of how difficult it is to write code that another person can understand and rerun and gives the same output. So we do some very concrete things like that. We bring in some software engineering perspectives. We talk about like the difference between functional and object-oriented programming. We talked about like programming style and what it means to write good and readable code.
Oh, this is cool.
Yeah. And we also do, I have 3 or 4 weeks in there where we read some philosophy of science and talk about it. So, for example, to start off talking about exploratory data analysis, we read a highly excerpted version. No, I changed it. Last year, it was an excerpted version of Bogan and Woodward's data phenomena paper. But I changed it because it was like that assumes you know a lot about physics. So I have a book chapter that describes this data phenomena theory distinction. So I can characterize exploratory data analysis in terms of we have data and we're trying to develop phenomena, which are patterns in the data, like sort of clean, identifiable patterns in the data. They're not yet theories that explain anything. That is going to come sort of later in the process of scientific research. In exploratory data analysis, we're just trying to identify patterns. We read a bunch of Sabina Leonelli, unsurprisingly.
She's kind of like really leading the charge in a number of different.
A few of her papers. We read a paper by Oljana Feast. Sort of a philosopher of psychology, I think is her primary thing, but she has a couple of really good papers on the replication crisis. So we sort of, and like she's arguing that like actually the replication crisis isn't a replication crisis. It's a completely different sort of more theoretical problem. So we read that and talk about that. I've taught it twice so far, the last 2 falls, and it's a lot of work because I have to like write these lab exercises, these very concrete programming exercises that I need to develop, and also like figure out what philosophy readings we're going to talk about and how to get like grad students with no philosophy background through these papers.
Right.
But at least last semester, the students seemed to really get a lot out of it. Like they really got into both the concrete data science side of things, as well as like reading these philosophy papers and reflecting on their work as young scientists. I shouldn't say young, as sort of early career scientists.
That's fascinating. This is, I mean, when you think about the courses that you're going to remember for in your academic, time. I mean, this sounds like a phenomenal course, and especially, the course that brings together people from a variety of disciplines can be, sounds like a great course. And so, I hope, is this something you get to teach every so often?
The way my course distribution works, I teach one grad course a year.
Okay.
And we don't have a philosophy grad program. So what I teach is this course.
Okay.
And actually, there's some efforts towards some sort of data science master's program.
Yeah.
Like, we started working on it, and then pandemic, and it's kind of on hold, but we might be starting to work on it again in the near future. So it's still a few years down the line, but this course will be like one of the core courses for that master's program. So I will get to teach it regularly, not just to the PhD students, but also to like people getting a master's degree in data science headed into industry.
Fantastic. And so, okay, well, thank you for sharing about that course. And before, got just a couple more questions. We'll be done. It's gone a little bit long, but I've been enjoying the conversation thus far. Why don't you just? So I didn't want to leave the conversation without at least kind of getting at kind of like where you're at in terms of your own research. I see on your website, you have some particular projects. I just kind of wanted to see what you're. Yeah, what are you wading into now, or perhaps have been catching up with that you started at UC Davis? What are the big research projects that maybe one or a couple that you're interested in, and how are those going?
Yeah, so I am currently. I mentioned a paper I'm hoping to get accepted in the near future. Just had another paper accepted actually at an epidemiology journal.
Cool.
That's about sort of this statistical method used by this statistician who's been funded by the fossil fuel industry to manufacture doubt about air pollution.
Oh, fun.
That paper has been a journey. It was like, it's very technical stats. But like, I haven't published in epidemiology before, so figuring out like how to present it in a way where the epidemiologist didn't think I was being like too critical of this one person's method. That just got accepted recently. The stuff I'm currently working on now, and I'll be presenting at conferences and stuff this summer, and fingers crossed as part of a symposium at the PSA this fall.
Oh, great.
One project is working with a grad student here, a cognitive psychologist, to develop an instrument for assessing views of the general public on values in science kinds of questions. So this is inspired in part by a paper that Karen Kovacka wrote a couple of years ago about how like misunderstandings, not so much about the nature of science, but about things like the value-free ideal or Galileo narratives, for example, might be exploited to manufacture doubt about climate change.
Yeah.
And so I basically had money to hire the grad student as a GSR for the year, and one of the things I wanted to do was like, well, let's see if we can develop an instrument, and you can bring in your knowledge of psychometrics, and we can like develop something that could be used to actually test that. So that's cool. We've wrapped up data collection on that, and we've been doing sort of the psychometrics analysis, and then in a few more weeks we'll actually be starting like the more substantive analysis of like the question Karen raised and a few other philosophers of science have raised in the vicinity. So excited to present those things this summer. And then the other project that I'm working on with the same grad student is a big text mining project of race science in the 20th century. So this is science used or misused to try to rationalize white supremacy. We identified some high-profile researchers like Arthur Jensen and Philip Rushton, who were funded by this organization called the Pioneer Fund. We have the text of this race science, this fringe race science journal called Mankind Quarterly, and we're getting the text for several psychology journals. And the idea here is to use text mining methods to look to see basically our ideas that originate in the race science journal kind of diffusing out into mainstream psychology between 1960 and 2010.
Okay.
And so the idea is to sort of understand how these ideas spread from sort of this race science fringe into the more reputable mainstream over this period of time.
Okay, I would be interested to hear. Be interesting to find out. And you said specifically into these particular psychology journals, right? And then yeah.
So I've been reading a lot of work by historians and sociologists on race science and the race science community. And there was kind of a switch starting around the 1930s or so. What happens, so prior to the 1930s, sort of anthropology, especially in the 19th century, anthropology was sort of the sort of central place for race science.
Yeah.
And then in the early 20th century, Franz Boas becomes very influential, sort of pioneer or initially develops this concept of the social construction of race. And anthropologists largely move away from a biological understanding of race. Early 20th century. By the 1930s, especially with to some extent what like Americans are seeing with eugenics in Nazi Germany, sort of connections with eugenics start to become discredited. A lot of explicit sort of race-based research starts to become discredited. And then sort of over the next 20 years, like race science significantly declines in popularity, becomes much more marginalized, including some very senior figures across various fields. In the 50s, in reaction to Brown versus Board of Education, start to form Mankind Quarterly, the Pioneer Fund, these sort of little pockets to support various race science research.
Huh.
And it seems like at least the high-profile people who get supported out of this are psychologists. Arthur Jensen, Philip Rushton, Hans Eysenck. There's also, for example, Linda Gottfredson, who's not as well known, but was relatively prominent in these circles, is, I think, like in an education school, but is trained as a psychologist and is doing that kind of work. And then, like in the 60s, Arthur Jensen sort of develops sort of, I think it's starting in the 60s. There's a big use of like twin methods from genetics for these sort of psychological questions, and we get the beginning of behavioral genetics. That seems to be like an intellectual community that has this very complicated relationship with race science. Aaron Panofsky is a sociologist who has written about this a lot, and I'm like gradually plowing through all of his works on the relationship between the race science community and the behavior genetics community.
Wow, that sounds like a fascinating and worthwhile project. I'm curious, Oh, so kind of a methods question. How will you, what will give and provide evidence that these, but based on your work, the bibliometric analysis from these journals from this period of time, that these ideas have sort of crossed into mainstream's ideas, politicians' ideas, the social realm? What are going to be some signs you'll be looking for?
Yeah, so in this project, we're just looking at sort of uptake within the mainstream scientific community as represented by articles published in, we had hoped to get 10 academic journals. It's going to be more like 4 because some of them, like, we don't have an institutional subscription to, and the American Psychological Association's journals are really hard to get access to for this kind of thing. So we have about 4 journals. We have the text of more or less all of the articles from those journals published over this time. And we're going to primarily use a method called topic modeling, where the super short explanation of what you're trying to do is identify latent topics in documents based on the patterns of words that appear in them. So the idea here would be, hopefully we can see like the Mankind Quarterly journals over here sort of all are big in this one topic, and we see that topic appearing over here in the mainstream journals and maybe getting larger over time or waxing and waning or something like this. And then I have a very recent paper where I have sort of some methods that build on topic models to think about these in a spatial way, so we can use the topic models to think about how these things are positioned relative to each other in sort of a spatial model. And so we can think about like, oh, do we see, okay, here's Mankind Quarterly, like running through this trajectory. Here's this other mainstream journal, its stuff is spread all over the place, but look, there's this like thread of articles that are kind of interspersed with the Mankind Quarterly thing. Those might be the kinds of things.
Very nice. Yeah. I know. I'm familiar with digital HPS. My former advisor was very much adept at, interested in topic modeling, and it's really cool to see these kinds of these tools apply to these interesting questions like this. So, yeah, good luck on the project.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think I've kept you long enough. Why don't we finish with the last question? And I'm very curious because you've worked in a variety of facets of philosophy of science. What do you take to be the greatest challenge facing philosophy of science today?
Yeah. So I think our greatest challenge today is going to be the retention of junior folks in the field. Both grad students, people who just got their PhD, maybe even folks who are like still on starting on the tenure track. And I think especially for people who are marginalized in professional philosophy because of things like their gender, their ethnicity, disability, because they didn't go to a prestigious school. I think sort of along the lines of the Great Resignation that we're seeing a lot of discussion about with like people walking away from shitty jobs. Right now, in academic philosophy, the job market's been bad for a long time, and it's just gotten really absurdly terrible recently. I haven't looked at the numbers, but it's like single-digit numbers this year for philosophy of science or something just incredibly awful.
Really? Oh, geez.
I haven't looked at it, but I think I've heard something like that. It's just like...
Well, it's also, there's some really... there's some really pretty incredible numbers where it's like all of the placements come from top 20 schools or like almost all or something like that. And I know history, not philosophy, but history had some interesting statistic where if you were in a top 10 school, like majority of the placements came from those ranked from 1 to 10. You were 3 times as likely to have been placed that year as opposed to just being in 11 through 20. So there was that big of a jump, even amongst the top 20 schools. And so, I mean, yeah. And
I think like faced with that job market, I think a lot of early career folks are going to be like, okay, I can put up with some terrible adjuncting position where I'm teaching 4, 5, 6 classes a semester at 2 different schools.
Yeah, commuting back and forth.
Like however many, indefinitely. Maybe I'll end up, and like maybe possibly I'll get a job where I'm living far from my family and friends. I'm doing a lot of teaching. I don't really like where I live. And like I'm marginalized in both my department and my field. Like I think we'll see a lot of people just saying like, no, I'm not going to do that. And I think this like just isn't a concern in terms of like the diversity of the field and inclusion and equity issues in the field. I think it's also like folks coming out with these backgrounds, I think, are the ones who have historically done the most creative, interesting, socially engaged philosophy.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about like feminist philosophers of science who really like, we wouldn't have science, values, and policy as this area of philosophy of science today if feminist philosophers hadn't spent like 30 years criticizing the free ideal, being like totally marginalized in the field for it. So I worry that like this is going to be bad, not just for these individuals. I mean, I think it honestly would be good for these individuals. If philosophy is pretty hostile to you because of your background, and the best outlook is a pretty crappy job, and you can do better in a non-academic position. Like I think that's probably going to be better for a lot of individuals, but I think it's going to be really bad for philosophy of science.
Right. We're going to miss out on that, which obviously, as you just described, was so pivotal for promoting some kind of changes in the field, new progress, that it might not have as many opportunities to do so. Yeah, it's really unfortunate. It's one of those things where, there's shifts in changing perhaps early on how people are to think about the purpose of getting training in philosophy of science, and almost like it's an epistemic. Studying it is it's a goal in itself. But yeah, there's some real logistical concerns, and I don't know. Do we see anything? Do we see this changing at all, or do we see it kind of being, Yeah,
I mean, there are certainly initiatives like the underrepresented philosophers of science mentoring program.
Okay.
There's that which pre-existed COVID, and I've been a mentor to 2 really great early career people through that, who are both seriously thinking about leaving academia.
Yeah.
Which is part of the reason why I think this is going to be the big challenge. There's also like there are going to be some changes in the women's caucus. It looks like it's probably. I don't think the membership of the women's caucus has totally figured out what we're going to have instead, but it is going to be broader, addressing a lot of these different dimensions of diversity and marginalization in the field.
Good.
So like there has been progress, and there are some initiatives to address this, but I think like I don't see any initiatives addressing like the long-term adjunctification in academia in general, and like the specific crisis of COVID. And I think that's going to be really hard. Like I don't think that's even something that like the Philosophy of Science Association can do much about, because what we really need is like more faculty jobs and better faculty jobs.
Or, I mean, I suppose if there's some sort of other, like I've seen in other departments, they have some more longer term non-tenured positions that, like in math departments and things like that allow, folks to take like 6-year terms with renewable 6 years. Not like we should, I'm saying, get rid of the traditional faculty tenure job, but I don't know. If that's not going to happen, perhaps there's other variations that I think have been adopted by other programs and by other departments that perhaps we could start seeing. But I don't know. You're right. But I think it is two separate questions. One, in terms of the limited number of jobs, but the other question, which I think the PSA, yourself, we could, is look toward is getting in those underrepresented groups and creating more opportunities for just expanding and with moving toward inclusion within the field and not excluding those based on all this stuff. The lack of jobs is just one part of it, and it's hard. Yeah. So good. Well, thank you, Dan. I appreciate you sharing that. I think that's it's very pertinent today, and I'm interested to see how things go. But anyway, thank you so much for chatting with me this Friday. I hope I didn't keep you too long from your run. I hope it's still nice enough outside to go and get a nice, had a nice exercise and get back to doing things. So, but anyway, take care. Good luck. Hope to see you at a conference or two this term. Are you associated with the SPSP?
I'm not. I've gone to SPSP once or twice.
Okay.
But I don't regularly go. I tend to like smaller conferences a little bit better.
It's a big one. Yeah.
So the one I'm most excited about is VMST. That's Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology.
Oh, really?
It's
okay. I gotta look that one up.
Conference at UT Dallas every year.
Is Matt?
Yeah, Matt Brown runs it.
Matt Brown? Okay.
Yeah. And that has become, it started in, I think, 2010, and I've gone to all but one, maybe two. And it's become this really fantastic community for folks interested in science, values, and policy, folks interested in bioethics. It's roughly 80% philosophers, even though it's nominally interdisciplinary. But there are usually a few historians, political scientists, psychologists in the mix as well. So it's a little bit of an interdisciplinary space. It's also a very inclusive space. Like the gender ratio is about 50-50 of participants in the last 50 years. So like better than philosophy of science on the whole. Yeah. There have also been some steps to make it explicitly trans friendly and trans inclusive, sort of recognizing that recently philosophy has not necessarily been a very welcoming place for trans folks.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's really fantastic to hear, and I definitely see that trend with a number of these, especially like the newer conferences, especially related to values and particularly related to values, but they're led by some really great people in philosophy of science who are, are just very well connected in terms of understanding and promoting these kinds of things. So very happy to hear. Thank you for the suggestion. I know you were just talking about. I'm going to look into it and see. Yeah, it might be something worth attending. So,
it's also a really supportive community as well. Q&A time is not we're going to fight about your paper. Q&A time is very much supportive. Here's an interesting question. Here's an interesting direction you can go next. I wasn't really a grad student during the time it's been going on, but I know several folks who have come up as grad students and found it a very nurturing environment to be a grad student in.
That sounds great. I think it reminds me of my first experience at a philosophy of science. It was the PSA 2012, and I'd just come out of a talk, and in the other room, the thing was there was two male philosophers that were just shouting at each other, going back and forth over God knows what, taking over the session. And I mean, we all believe about our ideas and have very strong wills. But I was like, wow, is this what philosophy is? Like, is this what's going on? So, and since going to these smaller workshops and, kind of boutique conferences, like I've come to know, I've only seen like a lot of the times just a tremendous amount of support and encouragement for new ideas and new thinking. And that's what I think was so cool about philosophy of science in general. You can see that a lot. So.
Yeah. I think all of the regulars at VMST really value it for being a supportive place. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right, Dan. Well, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me and letting me ramble on for over 2 hours.
Not at all. I think I got a lot out of it. I'm sure some of our fellow philosopher of science listeners or those potentially interested in studying or going into it will get a lot out of what you've shared. So thank you for sharing your experience. And be well. Have a wonderful Friday and talk to you soon.
Thank you. You too. Bye.